They say music has the power to calm savage beasts, but on the rain-slicked streets of downtown Seattle, a different kind of music was about to teach a deadly lesson. If this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's video will take you even deeper into the world of warriors who walk unseen among us. Marcus Chen had been playing his violin at Pike Place Market for 3 years, his haunting melodies drawing crowds of tourists and locals alike. Few who dropped dollars in his open case knew that before shrapnel took his sight in Fallujah, he'd been one of the most lethal operators in SEAL Team 6, with over 200 successful missions under his belt. The regulars knew him as the blind Asian musician who could tell you the weather by the way sound traveled through the market's corridors. The local vendors protected him like family, especially Maria from the flower stand, who'd seen something in his precise movements that spoke of carefully contained power. On this particular rainy Tuesday evening, the market was nearly empty as closing time approached. Marcus played Vivaldi's Winter, his fingers dancing across the strings with the same precision they'd once used to disarm explosive devices. His heightened senses catalogued every footstep, every conversation, every potential threat, old habits that had kept him alive through countless operations. The Shadow King's motorcycle gang had been pushing into Seattle's territory for months, their reputation for violence preceding them. They specialized in protection rackets and human trafficking, leaving a trail of broken businesses and broken bodies across 3 states. Well, what do we have here? The voice carried the artificial roughness of someone trying too hard to sound threatening. A blind beggar making our streets look bad. Marcus continued playing, but his trained senses had already mapped the threat. 6 men, moving with the swagger of predators who'd never met real danger. The leader, whose boots needed resoling on the left heel, carried a knife in his right pocket. The others were armed too, cheap pistols, poorly maintained based on the smell of rancid oil. "Hey, Stevie Wonder," another voice called out. "This is Shadow King's territory now. Street performers need to pay a tax." Marcus finished his piece with deliberate calm, each note perfect despite the growing tension. Around him, the few remaining vendors quickly closed their shops, recognizing the signs of impending violence. "Gentlemen," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded elite warriors, "you're making a serious mistake." The gang's laughter echoed off the market's walls. Their leader, who went by Razor, stepped closer. "Look at this, boys. The blind man thinks he's tough." Maria, closing her flower stand, started to protest, but Marcus shook his head slightly, a gesture so subtle yet commanding that it stopped her instantly. "Last chance," Marcus offered, carefully placing his violin in its case. "Walk away. Find. Easier prey, live longer. Or what?" Razor's voice carried genuine amusement now. "You'll play us a sad song?" Marcus stood with fluid grace, his movements precise and controlled. Everything about him changed in that moment, his posture, his presence, the very air around him seeming to crackle with contained energy. "No," he replied quietly. "I'll give you a demonstration of why some musicians are best left alone, and why some blind men see more than you could imagine." The gang members spread out, trying to surround him, not realizing they were positioning themselves exactly where he wanted them. Their boots on wet concrete told him everything he needed to know about their positions, their breathing patterns, revealing their training or lack thereof. "Boys," Razor commanded, "teach the blind man about respect." Marcus allowed himself a small smile as he heard the first man move. The Shadow Kings were about to learn why some street performers have military records that remain classified, and why some predators only pretend to be prey. The first Shadow King never saw Marcus move. One moment he was reaching for the blind musician, the next he was airborne, his trajectory precisely calculated to crash into 2 of his companions. The sound of bodies hitting wet concrete echoed. through Pike Place's empty corridors. What the hell? Razor's artificial bravado cracked as he watched his men scramble to their feet. How did you... Sound, Marcus explained calmly, shifting his stance with lethal grace. The way your breath catches when you're about to strike, the angle of your boots on wet stone. I don't need eyes to see you telegraphing every move. Two more gang members rushed him simultaneously. Marcus moved like flowing water, his decades of training translating into devastating efficiency. The first attacker's momentum was redirected into a market pillar, while the second found himself suddenly unable to breathe, a precise strike having collapsed his solar plexus. Maria, watching from behind her partially closed stand, saw what the gang members couldn't. How Marcus had positioned himself so the market's acoustics would amplify certain sounds while masking others. He wasn't just fighting, he was conducting a symphony of violence. "He's one man," Razor shouted, drawing his knife. "And he's blind. Take him down." But that one man had spent years training elite operators in close-quarters combat. Each movement was precise, economical, learned in darkness during countless night operations. The blade's whisper through air told Marcus everything about its trajectory, allowing him to grasp Razor's wrist and apply carefully calibrated pressure. The knife clattered to the ground as something in the gang leader's arm made a distinct popping sound. "I learned to fight blind long before I lost my sight," Marcus explained, his voice still calm despite the violence. "SEAL training. We spent months working in complete darkness. Sound, air pressure, vibration. They tell you everything you need to know." The remaining Shadow Kings drew their pistols, but Marcus was already moving. The market's architecture became his weapon. He'd spent 3 years memorizing every corner, every echo, every advantage the ancient building could provide. A vendor's cart crashed over, startling the armed men. In that moment of distraction, Marcus closed the distance. The first gunman's weapon was dismantled before he could fire, its parts scattering across the wet floor. The second managed to squeeze off a shot, but Marcus had already calculated its trajectory from his stance and breathing. The bullet hit empty air as 3 more gang members went down, their own momentum turned against them with devastating precision. "Impossible," one of them gasped from the ground. "Nobody moves like that." "SEAL Team 6 moved like that," a new voice called out. Detective Sarah Martinez stepped into view, her badge catching the market's fluorescent lights. Especially their close-quarters combat specialist, the one they called Shadow Walker because he could navigate any battlefield blind. More figures emerged from the market's shadows, plainclothes officers who'd been watching the Shadow Kings for weeks. They'd known about the gang's protection racket, but hadn't interfered when Marcus was targeted. Some predators needed to learn their lessons the hard way. "You knew," Razor accused Martinez, cradling his injured arm. "You knew what he was." "We've been tracking your operation across 3 states, Martinez confirmed, "but taking you down through normal channels would have meant months of court battles and witness intimidation. So when we heard you were moving into Pike Place, we decided to let you meet its guardian instead." Marcus stood relaxed now, his posture again that of a simple street musician. But the Shadow Kings had learned to see beneath that facade. They'd discovered why some blind men move with such confidence and why some warriors choose to hide in plain sight. "Your choice is simple," Martinez announced. "Surrender now, or—" She glanced at Marcus, who had retrieved his violin and was calmly checking its strings. The night was far from over, and the Shadow Kings were about to learn that some lessons come with a soundtrack, and some musicians know more than one way to make people dance. Razor made his choice with the desperate recklessness of a cornered animal. Drawing a hidden backup pistol, he grabbed Maria, using her as a shield. "Back off! All of you!" The police officers tensed, but Marcus simply lifted his violin to his shoulder. "Interesting choice," he said softly. "Let me play you something appropriate." The first notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata filled the market's corridors. The haunting melody seemed to come from everywhere at once, the ancient building's acoustics transforming it into something otherworldly. "What are you doing?" Razor's voice cracked with confusion and growing fear. "Creating cover," Marcus replied, his fingers never missing a note. "The music masks other sounds, like the two SWAT officers moving into position behind you, or the K9 unit approaching from your left." Detective Martinez watched in amazement as Marcus conducted both his symphony and the tactical response simultaneously. Each crescendo covered the sound of moving officers. Each quiet passage drew Razor's attention in precisely calculated directions. "You're lying," Razor snarled, but his head kept turning, trying to track threats he couldn't quite hear. "You can't—" "Can't what?" Marcus continued, playing one-handed as he slowly approached. "Can't understand the acoustic properties of century-old architecture. Can't calculate how sound waves bounce off wet stone. Can't use music to disorient someone whose entire tactical awareness depends on what they can see." Maria felt Razor's grip loosen slightly as doubt crept in. That moment was all Marcus needed. The violin's final note transformed into a precise throw, the bow striking Razor's gun hand with surgical accuracy. As the weapon clattered away, Marcus closed the distance with the same fluid grace that had made him legendary in the SEAL teams. 3 seconds later, Razor joined his men on the wet concrete, his world reduced to pain and the growing realization of his mistake. "You know what the hardest part of SEAL training was?" Marcus asked conversationally, retrieving his bow. "Not the physical challenges or the tactical exercises. It was learning to operate effectively blind, underwater at night, in sandstorms, through smoke. We learned to fight using every sense except sight." Detective Martinez moved in with handcuffs as Marcus checked his violin for damage. "The Shadow King's reign ends tonight," she announced. "We've got enough evidence to put them away for decades." "Evidence you couldn't have gathered without letting them walk into their own trap," Marcus observed, his enhanced hearing picking up the arrival of transport vehicles outside. Maria, still shaken but recovering, understood finally why the blind musician had chosen this specific spot for his performances. Not just for the acoustics, but because some warriors never stop protecting their chosen ground. The market vendors, she realized. "You've been guarding them all along." Marcus smiled, beginning to play again as the police led the gang members away. "Everyone needs a purpose," he said between notes. "Some of us just choose quieter battlefields." As word spread through Seattle's criminal underground about that rainy night at Pike Place, the story grew into legend. They spoke of a blind musician who could fight like a shadow, whose music could disorient even the most hardened criminals, whose quiet presence protected one of the city's oldest landmarks. Detective Martinez, filing her report later that night, found herself adding an unusual recommendation that certain street performance permits be automatically renewed without review, and that some musicians be recognized as unofficial guardians of public spaces. The next morning, Marcus returned to his usual spot, violin in hand. To passers-by, he was again simply the talented blind Asian musician whose music enhanced their shopping. But the vendors knew different now. They'd seen why some warriors choose to hide in plain sight, and why some music carries the echo of distant battles. "Some protectors," Maria told a curious tourist, "don't wear uniforms or badges. Some just play violin and wait for the moment they're needed." The market had changed, though few could see it. In its shadows, a new kind of peace was maintained by a different kind of warrior, one who had learned that music could be both art and weapon, and that some battles are best won without ever being seen.